This book was so good that it satisfied every reading desire I had to the point that I no longer wanted to read. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I am going to be sharing with you the best books that I read in 2023. So I am really excited. There are surprisingly a lot of books, and I swear they are not all the books I read this year. I'll maybe figure that out and add that at the end. And I'm also going to do my best to not gush at length about every single one of these books because I really did love them all. I'm going to go ahead and start with Thomas Hardy's. I read, I think, 5 of his books this year, and I really enjoyed all of them. But I'm going to talk about my 2 favorite, which are Tess of the D'Urbervilles and The Woodlanders. I liked both of these books for very different reasons. I guess I'll start with The Woodlanders. Um, the Woodlanders, I feel like, is a book of Thomas Hardy's that you don't hear about that frequently, or maybe you hear about it, but it doesn't tend to be the one that people say is their favorite. This was my favorite because I felt like, even though it was somewhat earlier than some of his other more popular novels, I felt like this was sort of Thomas Hardy in a nutshell, but took care of all the problems that I didn't like in some of his other books. So I felt like you had, the love triangles or squares or pentagons like you do in some of his other books. The romance was there. The descriptions of the landscape was there, but I liked the landscape of being in the woods better than being on the heath. And maybe just because not having grown up in England or anywhere that has heaths or anything like that, I'm much more familiar with a wooded setting. And so it was easier for me to visualize. I also felt like the pacing of this book was a lot better than some of his other ones, but you still had the shocks and the surprises. And if you've read Thomas Hardy's books, they all have some similar elements. To me, The Woodlander felt like it had all of those elements to like a perfection in some ways. I don't think every aspect of this book is perfect, and I could probably say that of all the books that I read, but of the ones of his that I read, this was definitely probably my favorite of his that I've read so far. And I gave it a 5 stars without a doubt. In fact, all these books that I'm going to share are all my 5-star reads, if I haven't said that already. I don't remember if I have. So moving on to Tess the D'Urbervilles, I really loved this book. I felt like it felt a lot more mature in terms of the themes and the topics and was than some of his other books. To me in this one, I felt like it wasn't just about the story. It wasn't just about the shocking behavior. It really was critiquing how society at that time would treat women. It just addresses a lot of the issues that women at the time could have, and I think are even at stake for women today. So I just really appreciated the themes in this book and the way he addressed them. So something else you will see in this list is you will see a couple of authors repeated numerous times, and that's partially because when I read a book by an author that I really enjoy, I will read other books that are written by that author to see if there's other things that I like in the writing or if it was just a one-off hit. So another author who fell into that category for me this year was Wilkie Collins. So since I read it less recently, I will start by talking about The Moonstone. I love this edition. I love this cover, also the colors. But The Moonstone for me was a 5-star read. This was actually a reread for me. But I swear I remember nothing about this book. I read it like over 20 years ago in high school and reread it this year, and I loved it. I loved the like detective element in there, the mystery, the surprise, the drama, the melodrama, the butler. To me, it was all about the butler. And I loved the format that he used to tell his story, which is kind of like a detective interviewing, though what ironically wasn't the detective, but our protagonist in the story, he basically goes and he interviews like 5 or 6 different people who are all involved in the mysterious disappearance of the Moonstone. I thought that was just such a clever way of going about trying to solve this mystery. I'm pretty sure there were like 10 or 15 different times during the book where I thought I knew exactly who it was. And then something else happened and I was like, I have no idea. So I don't tend to read mysteries. I forgot that this was a mystery and I loved it. Every single last minute. Highly, highly recommend. That brings me on to No Name. No Name I just read last month in November and was such a surprise, pleasant read for me. Not because I wasn't expecting to like it. I assumed I would because I do like Wilkie Collins, but more because I really hadn't heard that many people talk about this book. And I loved this book. I almost want to say more than The Moonstone. The topics in this are very different. It's not a detective mystery, though there is, I guess, some mysterious elements in it. But again, kind of like with Thomas Hardy, I really just loved the themes that he talked about in here. Yes, there is a revenge sort of plot going on in here, but it's so much more than about this girl trying to get revenge. This book is about Madeleine Vanstone and what happens to her literally just internally when her life gets devastated. And it's to me in the sensation genre, and it was just so well done. Again, the formatting in this is really interesting. It's told in different scenes and moments in between the scenes. I did read an introduction that said that apparently that was because Wilkie Collins initially was also planning on making it into a play, which means that this would have been a book that would have had a play within a play at one point, which I also love. So I highly recommend this book. I'll stop saying that I highly recommend these books because I'm going to tell you right now, I recommend all of these books. The next book is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I really liked it when I was younger, and so I was really curious to see if I would still enjoy this story much later in life. I mean, I probably haven't read it in over 20 years. And I did. I loved it. I think I loved it more than when I was younger. I think I was able to appreciate a lot of the dilemmas that Jane faced. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about her and Mr. Rochester and everything that goes on with them as an adult and as a married woman and all those kind of things. And I did have a lot more conflicting emotions and thoughts about it, but it didn't take away from my enjoyment of the book because I think Charlotte Bronte in a lot of ways wants you to feel conflicted about what's happening. And I was very impressed that this book was written during the Victorian period because, yeah, their authors just love to shock people. Certainly shock Victorians' sensibilities. So that's Jane Eyre. Next up, I have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I was really excited to reread this book. I read it for the first time in college. And I just recalled really, really enjoying the class and the way that the book was taught and being really surprised by what this book is actually about beyond just sort of your monster story. I wasn't sure if I was going to have that same experience this time, and I'm happy to say that I did. I read Frankenstein, and two of the things that just made me fall in love with it all over again was one, I forgot how there are stories within a story within the story. And apparently that's something that I really enjoy is when an author can kind of have an inception kind of thing going on. I did also like that movie, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But I really appreciated that aspect of it and just the layers of people telling stories. There's some letters in here. Most of these books have letters in them at some point. I do like an epistolary novel. I do like letters in general. I just really liked the many layers of thought that come when talking about, a character as a monster and looking at why he's claiming he became a monster and people's reaction to this idea of a monster and the otherness of someone. I think it's very easy to read this story just on the surface as like a story with the monster and kind of see it as, the Frankenstein movies tend to portray it. But I encourage everyone to read this book because it's so much more than what you think. So going back to another favorite author who I read multiple works by this year, I'm going to go to Leo Tolstoy. This year I read for the first time Anna Karenina. I wasn't sure how I was going to like Anna Karenina. I had never read it before. It sounded very different to me than War and Peace, and it is. But I knew I really liked Leo Tolstoy's writing, and I loved Anna Karenina. I thought it was a great story, surprising story to me because I didn't know what some of the premise was or some of the story was surrounding Anna. So I wasn't sure what there was going to be left in the book. I did annotate it as I went. I know I'm really overexposed here, but you can see I had a lot of comments. The hot pink and red are favorite moments. There were a lot of favorite moments, which were really favorite lines because the writing in this is beautiful. I did read the Pevere and Velikonski translation, and I really enjoyed that. I also now own multiple translations of this book, and I'm really excited to see how this book reads in different translations. So this will be a read and reread and reread book for me. I think that's all I have to say about that. The other book that I read by Leo Tolstoy this year was War and Peace. Yes, I love big chunky books. I'm stuck wondering how I actually fit this many books in this year, knowing that these are just my 5-star reads. But somehow I did it. I love War and Peace. As much as I loved Anna Karenina, I have to say I do still like the underlying story in this book even more. Um, I'm not a person that gets bothered by the, going back before the War and Peace, because to me, one of the things that I thought was amazing in this novel, which Tolstoy didn't consider a novel, is how he makes you question, where is the war actually happening and where is peace actually found? And there's just an interplay of that throughout the entire book. I just take this novel for what it is and enjoyed every last moment. I will say that I did find this time that I really struggled with the end of the book, because the story kind of ends before you feel like the story ends. And then Tolstoy very much goes back into his philosophy of war and his philosophy of life and his philosophies about everything. Because if you didn't know, if you read Russian lit, be prepared to enter into a lot of philosophy about whatever. Um, and while I enjoyed it throughout the book, I forgot that at the very end, he kind of temporarily cuts the story short and really goes into all of his thoughts. And then you get bits and pieces of the story back in. And I just wasn't that interested in it this time. So I don't have a problem admitting this, didn't read all of the appendixes. I just skipped through them and just read the remainder of the story, because at that point, that's all I was interested in. I realized that at another point and at different times, I will probably go back and just read the parts that are really his philosophy. And then there may be other times where I go through and read the book as a whole. And I think all of those are okay. Do what you need to do, enjoy books in your own way, but I would recommend at least one time going through the entire book. Related to War and Peace being a 5-star read, I also read Tolstoy Together by Yi-Yun Lee. And this is 85 Days of War and Peace. This is basically a companion commentary, I guess you could say, on War and Peace. She basically did an online sort of group worldwide reading of War and Peace, where everybody who just kind of signed on read through War and Peace, and she had a schedule to get through the entire book in 85 days. If you have never read a long book, I really encourage you to try this with War and Peace. It was a lot of fun to just read and see other people's feedback on the book. It also kind of gives you a reading schedule that's kind of logical. This book was actually the reason that I chose the Paver and Volokhonsky translation, because that's the one that she uses and that quite a few people reading the book use. So it lines up the best with the reading schedule she has. I just thought that her idea of doing this was brilliant, and I really appreciated that she sort of compiled everything, because it was online. She compiled everything into a book format so that people could share it and continue with the experience. And I really enjoyed my experience with it. So it was a 5-star because of that. Going a very different direction and not a classic, another surprisingly 5-star read for me this year was The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa. Last year, I read The Memory Police, and I really loved that book. This is a beautiful book, guys. Not just the cover, which I also think is beautiful, but this book just is so many things that I love. It is about a housekeeper and a professor, and the professor is an aging gentleman who has, as it turns out, problems with his memory, and he's an old math professor. And it's just about this woman trying to help him. She's also a single mother trying to take care of her son and make a living, and the relationship that she tries and forms with this professor who is trying to hold on to math, because that's one of the few things that he can do as you're trying to learn about what is his disability. There's also another family member living nearby that's really odd, and I never totally feel settled about her place in all of this. But it's just a beautifully written novel. It's a very touching story. There is math in it, which I love for reasons I'm not even sure, because I'm not really a math person, but I do enjoy it. And I enjoyed the math in this. You're not doing math. They just talk about math. And I don't know. I just enjoyed that as well. But it's just a really sweet, touching novel. All right. I had another author this year that I read for the first time, and I was like, oh, I need to read everything this man has ever written. And that started by reading The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Oh, Guys, The Count of Monte Cristo, I loved this book. I read it very slowly over the course of, I think, a month, which ended up being like 40 or 50 pages. Don't quote me on that. A night. And it was so much fun. Like, I read it every night before going to bed. It was like the last thing I did every evening. And it was getting to the point at times where like I couldn't wait to go to bed because I was like, I've got to get ready for bed so I can read the Count of Monte Cristo. And I don't know that that was the best time of day to read it because then I would get so excited by what happened that like I'd have a hard time going to bed because I'd be like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? And I can't believe this happened. And my mind just got blown like again and again and again. And somehow the way I paced it, I unintentionally kept leaving myself on cliffhangers. So definitely do a reading schedule if you want to read this, but maybe don't leave yourself on a cliffhanger every single night. But I highly recommend this book. It is a tale of a young gentleman who is treated horribly unjustly, gets wrongly imprisoned, and then just sort of the consequences of that on his life and eventually on the lives of everybody else who was involved. I don't know how you could write a book like this with just so much scheming and plotting and backstabbing. I think it's creative genius going on here. That's The Count of Monte Cristo. I don't think I have anything else to say about it. Okay, before I go any further, I do want to take a moment to give you a chance to be involved in the great debate, which has to do, oddly enough, with my shirt. I bought this wonderful little shirt, and every time I wear it, I get comments about these little faces on here. So I'll show them to you real quick, a little bit closer. And the random great debate is, are the dogs on here Boston Terriers or French Bulldogs? One more time, I'll give you a closer look. If you care, you decide, comment below which you think it is. Boston Terriers, French Bulldogs. I kid you not, people debate this in public when they see my shirt. So I'm going to keep moving. I'm going to discuss a couple of books that I don't currently own. All of these books I took out of the library, but they're books that I plan on buying and owning because they were amazing. The first one I'll start with is The Legend of Ellie Monpress. And this book is actually an entire series of books. It is a fantasy novel. I read books 1 through 5, so all 5 in the series, all 5 were basically 5-star reads for me. This is probably the best fantasy series I will ever read. It's certainly the best fantasy series I've read today, and I don't think enough people are talking about it. It was so much fun. It was so exciting. I didn't think I liked sword fights until I read this book. And there are parts that like maybe are a little bit melodramatic, but I enjoyed it. I couldn't help myself. It was just an enjoyable read, and that just blew it over the top. It was really well written. The characterization was great. It was funny. It was exciting. It was well paced in all 5 novels. I cannot recommend it enough. If you like fantasy and you have not read this series, go check it out. I enjoyed this so much that this has made me want to read everything else this author has written. Another book that I read this year that I do not own is Rebecca by Daphne DuMaurier. I loved it. The mystery, the atmosphere, the drama, the unreliable narrator, the like not sure what's going on in this really weird mansion. Just read it. If you like books that have an element, like a very large element of mystery and that gothic feel, and you haven't read Rebecca yet, you're gonna love it. Oh, I just realized that I forgot to mention the other book by Alexandre Dumas that I read. Well, okay, I should have a caveat to that. I thought this was a book by Alexandre Dumas. It turns out it's not. It's actually by Alexandre Dumas' son. Go figure, writing family. So, and that book is The Lady of the Camellias, which one, I love this book cover. I can't find this in hardback, and in some ways, like, I don't feel bad about that. This was such a sad, moving, frustrating story about this young woman and her lover and just the experiences that they both have. I love the narrative voice in this. Loved this book. I cried and I didn't laugh because it is really dark and depressing at times and very disturbing stuff happens at the end of this book. All right, another 5-star read for me this year, which I have to admit was one of the most surprising books to me this year, was Moby Dick. I think I've talked about this in a few other videos of mine. I read the first couple of paragraphs and died laughing. Like, I thought it was so melodramatic and ridiculous. I was like, there's no way I could read this book and enjoy it unless I was literally just going to laugh the entire way through. And I'm sorry for those who like love this book and consider it like a very serious work of fiction. That was just not my impression after that first page, basically. Um, I did go on to read the rest of the book, mainly because at one point I think I had read something very depressing and I needed a good laugh. So, and I got many. I'm not going to deny. I got many a good laugh out of this book. But I don't know what happened. This ended up being a 5-star read for me, guys, because I'm convinced now that Herman Melville's a genius. Because I went from thinking this book was ridiculous to not really liking this book to thinking it was boring to by the final pages, I loved this book and everyone in it. And I swear I even picked up their accent and was struggling not to speak as a New England whaler. I don't know how any of that happened. Okay, I read it all. I read it with the audiobook in tandem at times. I read the chapters about the whales and descriptions of the whales and things that I never knew wanted to know about whales and whaling and the whale oil industry. And if you don't like to hear about whaling, do not read this book. It's not overly gory by today's standards, but they are hunting whales, if you know what I mean. It was great. I just loved it on ridiculous levels. And I kept like talking to my family about it and like just going on and on and on about Moby Dick to my family to the point where they were like, maybe we need to read this. And then they were finally like, maybe you need to start a booktube channel. But whatever. I made them sit and listen to it at times as well because it was that good. Has some pictures in here. I mean, the characterization in this book is a little bit ridiculous, but somehow it all works. And I think that was why I gave it a 5-star. There were still parts of this book that I thought were ridiculous and melodramatic and over the top and overdone, but for some reason it worked. Herman Melville made it work with these characters. He made it work in this context. He talked about things I did not expect him to talk about. He brought up issues I didn't see coming out of a story that's kind of sort of, but not really at all, a story about a man's revenge against a whale. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I agree now that this is a work of genius, but maybe not for the reasons that you think when you hear people say that. So be prepared should you ever read this book. Going on the theme of other books that made me laugh this year, I reread Shamela by Henry Fielding after having read Pamela earlier this year. Pamela is by Samuel Richardson and is an 18th century British lit classic. Henry Fielding thought that Pamela was a ridiculous book, the way it was written, the topic, the characters, everything. So he wrote a satire on it called Shamela. And it's just a quick, like 40 some odd pages, something like that. I'm pretty sure I laughed from page 1 to page 40. It is hilarious. It is absolutely ridiculous book, intentionally. And I mean, the guy made fun of everything he could possibly make fun of from that book. I will say this. If you're going to read Shamela, you have to read Pamela, all of it, to really appreciate Shamela, but it is worth it. It is worth reading Pamela just so you can read Shamela. That's all I'm going to say about that right now. I also read Do Not Say We Have Nothing. This was another book that really took me by surprise. I didn't expect it to like it as much as I did. I really loved this book. It touched me in a way I didn't expect to be touched. It was on themes I was not expecting, and I ended up wanting to learn more about this time period in China than I expected. But what really impressed me about this book was just how carefully put together it was. From the cover of the book to the different formatting on the inside, the insertion of pictures and music and notation, and there's just so many themes and topics in this book and so many elements in how this book that was put together that is just so thoughtfully done, and details are paid attention to that I think are often overlooked or taken for granted in books. And this novel picked up on them all, and I appreciated so many of them. I loved that there were elements of sort of magical realism in the book, or things that felt like that, while there was this trope of how are these two families connected, in that sort of mystery element. It wasn't overwhelming throughout the book to the point where I felt like that was what the book was all about, and I'm just trying to discover this secret. It's not a trope I particularly like, but in this book, I thought it was excellently done. I also read 1984 by George Orwell this year. This is the first time I've ever read 1984. I annotated the heck out of this thing and I read it with a couple of my friends as a book club read. And this is a book that, oddly enough, I don't know that I would say I would rank highly as a book I enjoyed, but I gave it 5 stars because I did feel like this is a book that everyone should read. I feel like it's a really important, significant work of fiction. The way this book is told is so fascinating. And sadly, I think there's so many things about this book that are relevant to things that are going on in the world and certainly in my country today. And it gets referenced a lot right now. And so I think for that reason alone, it's important that we read this book and know what it actually says. So this is probably my most serious 5-star book this year. I want to do 2 honorable mentions. The first one is A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. I read A Suitable Boy this year. This was a reread for me. I read it again 20 years ago. Apparently, this was the year of reading books I read 20 years ago. And this is an honorable mention because I did not give it 5 stars. And I really loved this book for what it is, which is just, I think it's about a year that you follow. I think it's 4 different families in India not long after it has gotten its independence from the British. With these families, you're seeing their struggle to not only figure out what makes a suitable match in marriage for this young woman, like who's a suitable partner for her. But I think this book as a whole deals with the theme of, now that we're independent, now that we're separated like this, now that we, India, are in this new space and sphere of our own, what is suitable? You know, is it suitable to still like English things? Is it okay to be friends with people who are Muslim? You know, given that we have this tension with them, is it still suitable to practice certain traditions? Is it, you know, what language should we be speaking? How should we be dressing? Where should we be going? Who should we be worshiping? Who should we be seeing? How do you date people? Do you date people? Do you do arranged marriages? Like, so many of these issues come up over the course of this extremely long book. And I just found that idea of what is suitable after this huge change just really profound and well handled. And I loved it. I loved this family. I think the reason it wasn't a 5-star read for me is because it is really long, and I like long books, but this was one of the few books that I got a decent way through, and then it felt really long. I think what got me through was I had to sit back and realize, like, it's feeling long because I'm feeling like I'm living every single day of these people's lives. And then I realized, yeah, I am. I'm with these people every single day for 365 days. That's pretty much what this book is. And once I realized that and accepted that and realized I did like these characters enough that I didn't mind spending every day with them, somehow that freed me up and I was able to sit back and relax. But I think that did also show me that, like, the pacing wasn't that great, and it either needed to be condensed or the pacing needed to be worked out a bit. I'm glad I read the whole thing. This is a book that I would definitely read again because I love the family. I love the characters. I really like Vikram Seth's writing. I would want to read this book again, but unlike some of these other books where I could almost reread them every single year, I realized this isn't a book that I could do. And this also isn't a book that I feel like I could recommend to every single person. All of these other ones, everyone who's watching this video, read them at some point in your life. This one, if I made like my own personal 1001 book list that you have to read before you die, I don't know if I'd put this on there. I really don't. And I feel bad saying that because I do like this book a lot. Just not that much. Maybe. I don't know. Anyway, A Suitable Boy. I did mention I had one more honorable mention, and that would be The Tale of Genji. I'm not done reading it yet this year at the time that I'm filming this. But I can already tell you it's not going to be a 5-star read for me. I do really enjoy this book, but it's kind of falling into the category as A Suitable Boy for me. Like, both of those I would say are easily a 4-star read for me. I would recommend them to some people. I think The Tale of Genji has a lot of things to recommend it. Parts of the story that one kind of drag, kind of feel long, kind of feel repetitive. And that there is like other things in the book that are, I think, just kind of problematic in the story. So which make it something that like I don't want to keep reading about these problematic issues over and over again. That said, I do appreciate the work of fiction that it is and its place in the history of Japanese literature. And I think that is profoundly important, which is why it would fall more into a 4-star category to me, because I think for people who are interested in Japanese literature or Japanese culture or Japanese history, I think it's a vitally important book. Even in the realm of just writing in general, I think it's a really important book. But I think for the everyday reader who's just looking for like books to enjoy and read and have fun with, I wouldn't say that about it. So my second to last book is The Unlikely Escape of Uriah Heep. And this is by H.G. Parry. This was an unexpected book that I read because of the name Uriah Heep. I had owned this book for a while, but it wasn't until after I read another book that I went, wait a minute, I have seen this name before when I came across this character in another book that I read. And I pulled this off my shelf and I went, this must somehow be connected. And so I read this book. This is a fantasy novel where the basic premise is a young man starts realizing that he can make characters in books come to life. That's the basic premise of this book. How the characters are when they come to life is the part that makes this book brilliant and hilarious and excellent and a must read. This book was so funny. It is a fantasy book. There's drama. There's mystery. There are Victorian characters come to life in the most hilarious way ever. All I'm going to say about that is Heathcliff is my favorite. Mm-hmm. And so I would say if you've read a decent number of Victorian books, especially the super popular ones, Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, some of Charles Dickens, that kind of thing, then I would read this book. If you haven't, you're going to miss a lot. And I feel sorry for you because there is so much in this book to enjoy. So if you like Victorian literature and you're maybe looking to try and squeeze yourself out of that genre, or you just want something fun and fast and light to read this book. It is such a good, fun book. I had a friend who read it who she doesn't know a lot of Victorian novels, but she's at least heard of some of them, and she loved it too. So that's for this. That book gets me to my favorite book of this year that I'm only going to cut myself short on because I have to leave. And that book is David Copperfield. This was not only a 5-star read, this was my favorite book that I read this year. I absolutely loved this book. I mean, look at this version with the kites. If you know, you know. Like, literally, this book threw me in the worst reading slump I had all year. And the reason was this book was so good that it satisfied every reading desire I had to the point that I no longer wanted to read. Like, I read the best book and I just felt like there's no way anything else I pick up is going to be as good as this book is. And that meant that I really struggled to pick a book after this because I was just sure it wasn't going to be as good as this. So what was the point of reading ever again for the rest of my life? Thankfully, I got over that. But it led to like a couple of weeks of not reading and just like literally I would just sit and ponder David Copperfield, and I watched every version of movie out there of this book, and I liked them all for different reasons, but none of them are as good as the book. I, for probably 2 months straight, would tear up just at the thought of this book and some of the characters. And even now, when I hear some of the characters' names or hear people reference some of the scenes in this book, I'm just right back there. Like, I can see that little houseboat on the water with Ham and Mr. Peggotty and Mrs. Gummidge in the corner by the fireplace. It's just so good, guys. Have you read this? I know it's not everybody's favorite, and I haven't read all of Charles Dickens' works, so maybe it's not my favorite, but the fact that this may not be my favorite of his works is just, I can't even understand that thought. Anyway, that's it. I'm going to have to clean this mess up that I have here on my floor later. Those are all my favorite books that I've read this year. Tell me what your favorite for the entire year was down in the comments. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video. I'm thinking about doing some of my surprise reads for this year. Let me know if you'd like to see that, because they're not all 5-star reads, but they are books that took me by surprise. Also, don't forget to enter in on the great debate and let me know what you think, because yeah, it's really a topic for discussion. Yeah, so that's it. I gotta go. I hope you're having a great day and a great week, and so long for now.